Thank you, Rich. Mayor Karen Weaver, assorted dignitaries, fellow public servants, it's great to be here. This is a great issue to talk about. It's been an interest of mine for a long, long time. When I was the Homeland Security Advisor for the state, I was also chair of a group for Department of Homeland Security called the State, Local, Tribal, Territorial Government Coordinating Council for the Office of Infrastructure Protection. The acronym was known as SLITJIC. It always sounded vaguely off color to me, so the groups that we have, such as Fast Start, are much cleaner and more focused. But it's always been one of my interests, and I was happy to have this opportunity. So I want to follow up with what Rob said from EPA and what Keith said from DEQ, and I really do feel like I can talk about them on a first-name basis because we've become pretty tight over the last year as we have tried successfully to partner on these issues. And so I want to just talk about this same topic, but from a city level, if I could. I started, look at that, and I'm done. Got an itchy trigger finger there. I started back in February of 2016, as Rich said. I heard from Mayor Weaver, and as we say in the military, it was an opportunity for excellence. It was one of those assignments that you can't turn down, even though you might have second thoughts or misgivings, because it's doing the right thing for the people of the state of Michigan. So I'm not going to spend time on the timeline either. I just want to say that when we started on a very limited basis in March. I immediately met with Director Keith Cray and with Rich Barrett from the governor's office to come up with at least a tentative plan of action. And we had a plan using money that the DEQ made available to remove about 30 service lines around the city, just to give us some idea of what we were dealing with. And we found out that we had a number of issues. The soil compositions differed across the city. The placement of the service lines differed across the city. The junction boxes, the curb box where you would find that connection differed across the city. Two anecdotes very quickly to give you an example of that and the ongoing problem there. In many cases, they were put in the driveway, and back in the day, the driveways were all gravel. Well, when they paved over the driveways, they just paved over the curb box as well. Secondly, and again anecdotally, I've been told that in the 1950s or early 60s, Flint was going to be, an arbor city. So every resident was given 2 trees to plant in their tree lawn, their greenway. The city-owned right-of-way there, and they planted them right where the sewer line and the water line is to sort of mark where they would be. So as we dig these up, of course, we've got these large, older trees, some of them still beautiful, and we've got to either cut through the roots or we've got to cut the tree down, much to the chagrin of some of the residents. So we had a number of issues right from the start, and those are the ones that I want to talk about today. Whenever you're coming up with a plan, and that was the reason I think, invited for this opportunity, because I had done military planning when I was at the Pentagon immediately prior to this. You sort of say, well, what are your long-term goals? And the focus was, as the mayor said from the very beginning, that we have to get the lead out of Flint. And the question then is, where is the lead and how do you get it out of the city of Flint? And so we're focusing on 3 areas: the faucets and the fixtures, the internal plumbing to the homes, and then the service lines themselves. Where do you start between those 3? Well, one of the things that I want to emphasize is there are a lot of unsung heroes, and they are the scientists that are in the universities that supported us, as well as in the DEQ and the EPA. And one of those individuals that I sort of talked with often online, not being a scientist and just sort of being a planner, was Miguel Del Toro at EPA, and he said to me, well, where's the greatest density of lead in the city? It's the service lines. I said, check, we're going to start with the service lines. That actually complemented very well the concern of the residents. There was a distrust. I'm not talking about distrust of government because that's another topic. I'm talking distrust of the water system itself, and that trust wasn't going to be rebuilt unless we replaced the service lines. So it was easy to have that focus be on the service lines themselves, and that's where we started with this. The first or second challenge, I suppose, once you decide where your focus is going to be, is determining where the lead and galvanized service lines were. You saw on that first slide, I had the same picture, the iconic picture that Rob pointed out of the 3 pipes with the corroded pipe in the beginning there. And we were blithely thinking that we could replace these in a much shorter period of time because we were focused on lead. When you add lead and galvanized and that combination and the exacerbated problems that you have when you have that combination of lines, we had a much bigger problem, but we weren't sure how big that problem was. And you could see how it was aggravated by the city records themselves. The top is an example of the plat books. They identified in the plat book, they would identify the location of the curb box by the number of feet from the nearest intersection, and they would walk it in feet. Well, you can see the inherent inaccuracy when you're doing that. And secondly, there would only be a single letter there. There'd be an L or a C for lead or copper. And of course, we had many, many cases when, as I think Keith said, where you had homes that were lead on the city side and galvanized. And we didn't know if we had lead or galvanized or lead or copper, depending upon the economics of the situation there. So we had 2 points. We had to identify what they were, and then we have an inability to know exactly how large the problem is because we don't know how many service lines that we have to replace. That was important for 2 purposes. The first obvious one is planning. How do we know how much money to ask for if we don't know how large the problem is? And secondly, there's a lead and copper rule where if you go over, I think it's 2 consecutive quarters with above the federal action level, you've got to do an inventory of your lines. It was pretty impossible to do an inventory of our lines as to how many lead and galvanized lines we had at that time. As you see at the bottom there, that excerpt there that says Table 13, that's from the Rowe Engineering report, which way back at the beginning, this was one of the first things DEQ commissioned on behalf of the city. And if you look at it, you see a total of approximately, and I'm looking at the one under occupied parcels, so the red circle on your right-hand side, it says occupied parcels. You've got about 20,000 or so there if you subtract out the copper material. You've got about 20,000 homes where we have either lead or copper, or we have to consider it lead and copper because it was unknown. Again, it turned out that number is fairly accurate, but you don't know that going forward. That was based upon the incomplete records that we had at that time. So we did a certain amount of hydro excavation. We engaged with both the University of Michigan Flint and with the University of Michigan Ann Arbor. Again, scientists are the unsung heroes here, and they assisted us and specifically in trying to come up with a number for the EPA lead and copper rule inventory. We came up with the number of 29,000. If you notice, that number is in bold under the hydrovac column there. It is at best a guesstimate, and I say that for a couple reasons. We were trying to figure out exactly the best way to determine how many lines. We can look at the hydrovac, we can look at the replacement, but the replacements that we had done at that time were specifically targeted in neighborhoods in the city that we knew that we had lead lines. And so it was going to skew us high. The hydrovac was only about 160 samples, so it's way too small a sampling to use, but it was what we had best at the time. So we went with that one, figuring it was conservative in the sense that we thought it was high, but we figured it was the best number to use. So 29,000, and that's for residential parcels. Of those, we believe about 22,000 are occupied parcels. So we're still tracking with the 20 to 23 parcels that we have. Knowing that we had to do additional hydro excavation, we did, as I said, a certain amount in 2016. We have a contract, an RFP for a contract right now to do 6,000 homes that will be hydrovac'd across the city. And to make sure that I'm clear, that 6,000 hydrovacs is separate from the 6,000 homes where we're doing replacement. We're doing this one, we're starting at first, there's going to be substantial overlap. Yeah, from a planning standpoint, we should have done it first, but you got to go when you've got the funds and you've got the ability to move. So that will start sooner. That will start in early April, and we'll start getting results in on that, and we'll develop our numbers, not just the actual numbers, but the composition of the pipes and adjust fire as needed from there. So to do this, they got a couple of points, and that is if you end up in this situation, you have to think hard about what criteria to use. And this was a challenge because everybody in the city, remember, in early 2016 wants their service line replaced now. And you can't blame them. They've been living with this situation for quite some time. They've been living in fear and worse, uncertainty for quite some time. And we had to come up with some criteria that we knew would be defensible. So the first thing we looked at was who suffers the most from the effects of lead. And so we're looking at the elderly and children under 6. And so using the 2014 census data, we picked the neighborhoods that had the greatest density of those populations. Secondly, we looked at the data from the DEQ that we had thus far. Data may be idiosyncratic to a single home, but if we had neighborhoods which had a number of homes with high lead levels in them, then we were going to focus on those neighborhoods. I think, second one there, the age of water. As Keith Cray said, one of the largest problems here, when I show you a map of the city, the water treatment plant is up in the northeast corner of the city, so the homes down in the southwest corner of the city had water that was as old as 6 to 8 days, just sitting there having, lead and other bad stuff sort of leaching into the water. There wasn't the flow because there wasn't the use. Pipes were oversized. Once the problem, of course, occurs, it exacerbates the age of water problem because nobody wants to use the water. That is being resolved temporarily through a very systematic flushing program that's been done on a couple of occasions and will be again, but obviously that is a long-term solution that's needed there. And then finally, as Miguel Del Toro told me early on, you look for the greatest density of lead in galvanized lines in the city. So if you look at the map on the right with the pretty colors to it, that was done by University of Michigan Flint, Dr. Marty Kaufman's group. And the idea there is we take those criteria that I mentioned in the previous slide, we sort of put them all together and give us sort of the hot spots that we think that we need to focus on. The little blue dots are concentration of residences. And so we sort of focus on the red spots. And if you look at the area on the map on the left then, the zones 1 through 10 are the areas that the city is going to do replacement of service lines in 2017. You can see some hash marks on there above number 4, to the west of number 2, below number 8, and in the middle of 6. Those are the areas of greatest concentration. Those are the areas that were addressed in 2016. So, looking at it overall, we've moved forward with this plan. We've moved forward well. I will be the first to say that we wanted to truly have a fast start, and this wasn't as fast as we would have liked, but we've ramped up, learned from our mistakes, and learned from lessons learned about lack of certain capacity and records, and we are in better shape. We put out a bid this last Friday, which I'll talk about in a minute, that we're considering the bids now. One of the other issues is whether to use copper or plastic piping. What happened was I didn't know how to make that decision. I don't pretend to be a scientist at all, so I sort of asked a retired professor, Professor Emeritus, Dr. Mackenzie Davis at Michigan State University, a professor in environmental engineering. He did a literature search. We went through that, and based upon his recommendations and talking with city folks who had some other secondary issues, we felt that copper pipes would be the best way to go. The bottom line from his report was it costs more, but you've got a recycling cost. If you pull we believe that the pipes have greater longevity and less permeability, but they've got a residual value to them as well. And again, when you take in that inherent issue of including that we needed to rebuild trust of the citizens in the water system, we felt that copper was the way to go. That decision was made by city staff about the middle to late summer, though I didn't put out a memo on that until we needed to in November. Just a month ago, as you heard from Mayor Weaver, we heard from the Copper Development Association, and they have donated some copper piping to us, which should decrease our costs substantially for this year, and we thank them for that, as that was a huge shot in the arm. So for 2017, what's coming next, you'll see the focus, which we tried to mirror those hot spots, as we call them, from Dr. Kaufman's map. This will evolve, but if we do this 3 times, we will have the city covered. Again, using those same criteria, We hoped in 3 years of doing 6,000 homes per year that we will have all the lead and galvanized lines removed from the city of Flint, based upon the planning assumptions we have now. And as any of you know who have done planning, sometimes your planning assumptions have to change. Again, you can see the lined areas for the areas that we've already done, and we're building from that, and the hash mark areas where Consumers Energy is working this year, so we have to put that rather than have, they are already started. I understand integrated asset management. They're already started, and it was too late to sort of integrate that, so we have to put that off for next year. Below number 10, and then that area between 5 and 9 is what we're looking at for 2018. Keeps falling on me. So if we, I also want to point out the location of the water treatment plant. You can see how in Area 6, that was an area of concern to us because it was an age of water issue that we think contributed to the lead readings that we found there. And so we focused on that area, and then the near east side and then the west side, the far west side, had high concentrations of lead service lines. We are not finding so much anymore. And that's, again, a reason why we have to do the hydro excavation. We started out with almost 100% lead lines. At where we are right now is we've dug 950 holes at different residences, and 160 of those have turned out to be copper to copper. We don't like doing that, so that's why we're going to have the hydro excavation for next year. So I'm giving you the good and the bad. Another lesson learned, of course, was the importance of communication with the residents. You've already heard about communication between the interagency, between state, federal, and local, and I think that we are in good shape on that. The difference with communicating with residents is it is a long-term, ongoing commitment. You can't have one news conference and you're done. You have to have this as a continuous program. Over the past year, Mayor Weaver has held regular news conferences to update residents. It's on our website as to where we're working, as to how many homes that we've done, where we're going to work next. City officials continuously, and state officials continuously remind residents about where they can obtain water filters and replacement cartridges. We have continuous replacement or reminders about flushing their lines. We require the line to be flushed by the contractor and then by the homeowner thereafter. When we do the hydro excavation, we require that to be flushed. Every time it has to be flushed for 15 minutes. If it's a line replacement, we say it has to be flushed from every tap, every outlet you might have in the home. Finally, on this issue of communications, Michigan AARP, Dr. Paula Cunningham, the director, stepped forward and they volunteered and obtained the funds so that they could have volunteers go door to door and put out our door hangers for individuals at every residence. There is an issue, I know, between doing partial and full replacements. I can tell you if it needs to be replaced on the residential side, we made the decision early on, we're replacing it on the residential side. So obviously both the homeowner and the tenant resident, if it differs, has to give permission. This lengthens the process, of course, but it's absolutely necessary. In our minds, you have to replace the entire service line. You can't just replace the city side. And so having the AARP out there, DEQ has a group called the Core Team who does the same thing, going door to door, answering questions, letting the residents know what's going on. That sort of retail effort at the residential granular level really makes a difference, but it's an ongoing, continuing process. In 2017, from the feedback we've got, we're doing even more forms of communication. We're going to put yard signs in those streets and neighborhoods that we're going to do next so people know that that's coming next and that the work's going to be out underway. And we're reaching out to residents through Facebook and other social media, just targeted for those neighborhoods so that people know that that's coming. So we're far from done. There we go. Whoops. Again, the heavy figure. One more, Mike. We're far from done on this. We have funds. Bob Kaplan mentioned the WIN funds that the city has received, which are being used this year 2017, as well as some CHIP funds that are being used this year for service line replacements. But overall, this project will take, to do it 6,000 per year for 3 years, will take $106 to $108 million. I will tell you that the governor's office and the executive branch of state government have given us every assurance and firm commitments. They've been partners all the way through this, and I'm sure that issue will work out. So while there is funding needed and it is uncertain at this time, I'm certain that will be resolved. As you can see here, and was alluded to earlier by both Keith Cray and the mayor, you can't just replace the service lines. You have to look at the entire system of infrastructure. It's one of those things that it's not only a matter of repairing, it's a matter of sort of re-engineering. And that sort of takes me to my last slide when we talk about this concept of resiliency. When we talked about it, when I did critical infrastructure planning at the Pentagon, we talked about 3 phases. You can do replacement, you can do re-engineering, or you can do redundancy. Redundancy is the obvious one. It's also the most expensive. Best example in the state of Michigan is the efforts by this administration and the previous administration to create the Gordie Howe Bridge so that we've got a redundant trade passage between Ontario and Michigan and between Canada and the US. But it's big ticket items. It's expensive to do. So in this case, we have to look at either replacement or re-engineering. Re-engineering is also difficult, but long-term, it is the most cost-effective method. And so the extent that you can look early on at re-engineering, and I know that the governor's office discussed this with the mayor's office early on, and it was brought up at Mission Flint and at the WIC meetings that we had early on as to how we can re-engineer the system. It's the preferred method. Replacement, everybody can do replacement. That's having the integrated asset management plan. It is a form of resiliency. One of the things you have to tell everybody who's here from a utility or a city is you've got to make it clear to your city officials that asset management is not a luxury, it's essential. Look at Flint. It was one of those things that was ignored for years because we had a lack of funds to just do that basic asset management. You fall behind and it's almost impossible to catch up. You got the funds coming in from transportation, from the SRF, but if you fall behind, look at that chart, from Bob Kaplan, you fall behind on that and you can't play catch up. It takes 10 times as long to get it right side up. So, and Keith mentioned this, but let me reemphasize this. How accurate are your records on what your service line composition is and where they are? You may think you know, but let me tell you, everybody thinks they know. I mean, we had 2 different systems in the city of Flint. We had the plat books, and then we had these 3x5 index cards. Well, they were 2 separate systems, and they weren't the same. So then you've got to go through and say, okay, we've got to harmonize these systems and figure out where the discrepancies are. You got to get them all digitized, and then you've got to figure out where the flaws are. So they turned out to be about 63% accurate. I can assure you that's not good enough. I'm happy, frankly, that we only had 160 copper that we thought were lead or galvanized when we dug them up, because if it's 63% accuracy, it could have been higher than that. So I can't emphasize enough from the city point of view, how do you know your records are accurate? You know, the military side of me says, you know what, do an exercise. Have your water services department or equivalent get out there and say, okay, you know, we think that there's a lead outbreak, and tabletop that through as to how you know where that source of lead is if you've got that in one of the neighborhoods in your city, and work that issue through. If you do that, I think you'll be a lot closer. The last thing I want to do is just emphasize the last bullet here. It's been mentioned before, but it can't be mentioned too much in my opinion. That 21st Century Infrastructure Commission, that report that came out by the Governor's Commission, is visionary. But you know what? It only remains a vision. It will only remain a vision unless we act upon it and we follow it. There's always a high price tag for this sort of thing. We all know that. But I can tell you that if you learn anything from the example of Flint, is that the cost, if you don't do it, is much, much greater. So there are a lot of positive lessons to learn from Flint, and we'll be happy to talk with you about them at any time, any city, anywhere in the U.S., because you don't want to get in the same circumstance. But to avoid that, do it right the first time. Don't let things get behind, and follow that resiliency plan. Thank you.